The Medium is the new Blower Team game, and it's a game that before its release was getting a lot of attention from all sorts of gaming crowds for it being the first next-gen game, but also by having a soundtrack composed by Akira Yamaoka and Arkadiusz Reikowski, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, I'm sorry. Notably here, Akira Yamaoka, famous for the Silent Hill soundtrack, and that led a lot of people to think of this as a Silent Hill inspired game or even a spiritual sequel, given also the game's premise of two overlapping worlds, especially the spirit world being very reminiscent of the other world of Silent Hill. But being both a Silent Hill fan and someone who has also played other Blower Team games, I went in with tempered expectations. For reference, I have played all Team Blower games, having beaten both Layers of Fears and the new Blair Witch game, and also played a little bit of The Observer. And while I don't think of their games as bad or terrible, they all have a thing in common. They are horror games, and personally I think this team's horror isn't for me, which is a nice way to put it. Their game's horror up until now having a bigger emphasis on jump scares and other loud sounds, and visually often relying on horror tropes for their scariness, like the quote-unquote scary dolls, mannequins, and the big dark lanky monster that chases you around, and other horror tropes of course. And while I think The Medium might be their best game so far, it's also a game that still falls in a lot of these tropes. So let's get into it. First, we'll start with the story. A medium, the title of the game, is someone who can travel between the world of the living and the spirit world, being able to also coexist in both worlds at once. Mediums also have psychic abilities. They can use it in the spirit world, which, of course, all of this plays into the gameplay, which we'll talk about later. Our protagonist is Marianne. She's one of these mediums, and we meet her around the time her foster dad passes away, and we learn about how she uses her powers to help people move on when they pass away, as her dad and her worked in a morgue. It's also in this scene we get the start of our actual plot of Marianne visiting a Polish abandoned resort where the most of the game will take place due to a mysterious phone call from someone who knows about our main character's powers. It's very hard to talk about the resort itself without spoiling, but obviously, given the most of the game takes place here, that this place has a big connection to the spirit world, and that a lot of people died there and for some reason weren't able to move on. The story is okay, it's better in concept than it is in the way it's actually told and paced. I feel as you're just not told enough information at the beginning to care. In fact, it seems misdirected as being led to think that this will be a story about Marianne when it's really much more about the resort itself and the events that took place in it. Without spoiling, it involves World War II events and Nazi experiments that lead to the creation of mediums, which to me feels like something that already has been explored to death in the horror genre to the point of it being a trope. And there's nothing wrong with that. It is in fact the more interesting part of the story of the game, but it feels as the game doesn't know that, if that makes any sense. Marianne ends up being just a vessel for the actual story to take place. She's not a bad character, and she does have some connection, both direct and symbolic to the story that's being told, with her powers and backstory. But again, and maybe this is just me, but there feels like there's a big disconnect, especially as big pieces of the game, and personally some of the more interesting and visually unique pieces will happen without our main character, Overall though, the story is okay. The plot being uncovered is interesting, even if it ends up being nothing new to the genre. And personally, while I don't think this game does enough to stand out from other similar stories, I still enjoyed my time with it, and I don't feel like it was a waste of time story-wise. Now, moving on to the graphics, which I think it's important to talk about here before the gameplay, of course. This game gathering some attention from its two worlds being rendered at the same time, and it looks great. In the quote-unquote real world, the textures are really high-res, the lighting feels very natural. It may not come across well with the YouTube compression, but when you're playing it legitimately feels like something that's next-gen in its looks, and Poland, it's just not a place we usually see in video games, which is a nice change of pace. Now the other world is also nice to look at. At first I was a bit afraid that would be just very samey all throughout, with that orange tint and the stones with the overgrown roots everywhere, but thankfully the game does pull some meaningful and nice looking variety, especially in the pieces of the game without Marianne later on, which I'm not trying to spoil too much. And while there is some telltales that this is not a AAA game, it definitely punches above its pay grade in terms of graphical fidelity. Now, in terms of its optimization, it's hard for me to talk about. While I don't have very much insight into it, and it is in some ways the first true next-gen game, so, we have to take that into consideration. Also that it is an indie game, and it looks like this, that's very impressive as well. But, I don't know, to me it doesn't feel badly optimized. It runs smoothly, it doesn't need a high frame rate for the type of game that it is, so maybe it will bother you more than it does me. But personally, I'll take fidelity over frame rate in a game that doesn't really have much continuous action and a bigger focus on slow exploration. Soundtrack wise, I'll be honest, this was one of the few times I was a bit excited for it, being a Silent Hill fan. And while it's good, I was honestly a bit disappointed with its implementation in the game. It's just kind of background music, and it doesn't really stand out, which is a shame because I did go and check out the soundtrack after I finished the game, and there were quite a few good tracks in this OST that I kind of mostly don't remember from playing the game. It just feels like it goes underused. I was left wondering if this whole thing trying to invoke a Silent Hill feeling was done for marketing reasons, that or Blower team just doesn't really get what makes Silent Hill interesting. But this is just conjecture, and I'm not gonna be judging the medium as a Silent Hill game. I'm judging at its own thing. It just wouldn't be fair or even make sense. Now let's finally talk about the gameplay. Of course, for most of the game you play as Marianne. This is a fixed camera angle game with analog controls, evocative of those early PS2 horror games. And I have always liked analog controls in this type of games, despite its limitations when changing camera angles, and the medium does it well. Nothing particularly special, but it works fine. The game will for the most part have you exploring the resort while also solving simple puzzles, using your powers and the whole two-world dynamic. None of them are hard, they are in fact all very easy in a way that feels underdeveloped and messy. For example, sometimes a path will be locked in the real world and you'll have to go and unlock the path through the spirit world, and that's fine enough even if simple. The problem is the rules aren't consistent throughout the game. Sometimes you exist only in the real world, other times only in the spirit world, sometimes in both, and other times being able to switch between them, this ability changing depending on the puzzle at hand. This can end up feeling like a contrived way to make more puzzles, which is hard to justify given again the simplicity of the puzzles already here. For some context, the final puzzle, without spoiling, is the most complex puzzle, and even that felt very simple and easy. Then there is also these psychic powers that are a bit more consistent. These powers work on a charge. You can charge them in specific places in the spirit world, and you can have 2 slots, meaning they can be used twice before needing a recharge. There are sort of 3 powers that expand this charge. There is the shield that uses to protect against certain attacks and also crossing certain zones. Then we have this sort of psychic blast that is mostly used to turn on electric boxes in the real world through the spirit world, and a sort of quick time event to save you from an instant death by the pursuing enemy, which I'll talk about more in a bit. There is also a power that doesn't consume energy. That's this almost like X-ray vision type of power. It only works a few times to solve a few puzzles, and it's a bit of annoying because it's something that it's easy to forget you have, and it definitely felt like an afterthought, especially in a game that already offers 2 perspectives of the same locations. The only real positive of this game's simple puzzles, I would say, is it helps making the exploration more straightforward and therefore the pacing a lot more digestible, especially since I said that I found that the story had pacing issues. Now, the more actiony pieces of the gameplay, and this enemy sections, which will happen far and far between, but when they do happen they usually focus on stealthing around, this also having a few simple puzzles sometimes, as you might need to distract the monster that's looking for you. There will be also scenes where he pursues you in a more actiony section, where the game shows more impressive visuals as it switches between worlds seamlessly, and it's cool, I guess. I'm not a huge fan of this type of stealth in horror games because it's almost always very basic stealth riding on the scare factor of the game, and the medium unfortunately isn't scary, which is the last thing I wanted to talk about. Much like I said in the beginning, the medium suffers a lot from the same issues other Blower Team games have, where it doesn't really know how to keep up its tension and has a tendency to deflate it with cheap jump scares and music stings. Visually, it's also not very scary. The main monsters suffer from what I've also said in the beginning, the generic looking tall, lanky, dark figures. And one other monster slash enemy in this game just legitimately looks like a tentacle coming out of the ground, and it just kind of reminded me of tentacles from Day of the Tentacle, which is funny, but definitely not what I want to be thinking about when playing a scary video game. And the scenarios, while very nice to look at, they are also often very well illuminated, especially in the spirit world, where you would expect the game to have a darker and scarier atmosphere, but that really isn't the case. Overall, the medium is an okay game. It has some really good things about it, but doesn't really know what to do with those things. But to me, it's still the best Blower game I've played, and I hope that they keep improving and making better games in the future, hopefully. And I'll be giving the medium a 6 out of 10. Recommendations now, well, first off, don't go into it expecting Silent Hill because you will hate it. If you're looking for that PS2 style horror game, then I'm sure you'll get something out of it, but be aware that this game isn't trying to be an homage to PS2 games, I think, at least. Honestly, I think this game might be more enjoyable to watch rather than play, so maybe save yourself a buck and just watch a playthrough on YouTube. If you do want to buy it though, I would say wait for a discount. It is a 7-hour game, and it's not very replayable, given its very simple and linear story. Personally, I would wait until the game is in its $30 or around that mark to give it a try if you're curious. Regardless though, I hope this video was informative and it helped you make a decision, and hopefully you enjoyed it enough to subscribe and like, maybe even comment, which you can do for free on YouTube. Regardless of that though, I wish you a good day and goodbye.